Hello everyone, today I want to make a brief intro to my ancient and especially early medieval naval warfare, right? I'm actually a landlubber myself, even though I'm a good swimmer. That's really typical. I tried also my career in the Navy, but I wasn't probably cut for that. And for reasons that were mostly due to antisocial behavior, not much because I think I can't bet on that. I have some predisposition, not specifically for sort of naval strategy or anything, but maybe for some level of military capacity. I will never find out because if you don't join the army, you can't, right? So maybe with my title, if war breaks out and there is a mass levy, I'm surely going to be part of an officer cadre, but let's hope that's not going to be the case. Some of you will say, but how, Schwerpunkt? You talk about war bands, you talk about, the actualization of the self through self-sacrifice in holy combat. Granted, but how many of you are actually following that path, and for the same reason? But jokes aside, you've probably noticed that recently I haven't made so many of the older types of videos. Essentially, it's been a lot of new specials, mostly, of course, focusing on topics that you would probably consider like germane to my to my overall research pool. But we have also to carry on with the lottery/cycle, which forces me to cover certain topics that I know may have less views, but in this sense, I want to eviscerate pretty well and polish them to the degree that we explain why it is important learning about them. And naval warfare is definitely one of them, because when we talk about ancient medieval naval warfare, we're looking at an age in which fleets did a little, but essentially a little more than supporting terrestrial forces, mostly for logistical purposes along the coastlines, especially in areas like the Mediterranean, but there is a rich history also, of course, in the northern seas. We never talked about, East Asian naval warfare or something. We will expand at some point on this. So here we're looking mostly at the classical approach to naval warfare, not literally starting from antiquity, but arriving to, say, the Romans, the Viking ships, and so on. I already made lots of videos on this military historical unit type, and there is something more strategic, more tactical. So I thought today to continue this and to picture a bit better what we've been doing, what we're gonna do with this, talking about ancient warship in a broader sense, again, up also the early Middle Ages. And so this video essentially examines let's say, our channel in general examines the vessels that form the naval fleets of the ancient world, right? Exploring the methods used to construct them, for example, the ways they were crewed, and the practices employed to keep them operational. When we make a military historical unit video, if it is, a soldier, we list all the panoply, right? The arms and armor. When we look at ships, of course, like you can look at armament as well, but it's basically their structure that really matters the most, and mostly what matters in a diachronic and comparative way is explaining why certain ship designs came about historically when they could have simply not necessarily stayed the same, because the world changes, in fact, but in fact, for reasons that may not be immediately obvious, right? If you haven't asked yourself why, for example, towards late antiquity, ships became smaller and there is much less ramming, as a matter of fact, there is some greater emphasis on maneuverability. The answer is obvious if you have a broader sense of the political, strategic, and social situation of the era, but it may need some further explanation for those who, in fact, are unaware of this. We've seen it basically in every ship video that we've ever made, and deepen it further, given the the wide history of naval warfare, right? It should be pointed out, as I said at the beginning, that, by the way, the notion that was this dramatic naval activity in antiquity should be a bit better framed, meaning that, as we've seen also for land warfare, when we think about antiquity, we mostly look at this enormous, allegedly enormous armies, fleets, climatic battles as veritable showdowns that engulf an entire continent or something. The reality of warfare at the time naturally contemplated a much bigger amount of smaller engagement that, however, classical sources are not particularly fond of, for different reasons that are really traditional also in time. Basically, of course, ancient historiography is very different from, say, medieval one or modern one, etc. We partially explained this in other videos. So I, for example, this summer made a series about medievalistics that somehow shows there, if anything, from the late Middle Ages to the basically to our times, how or why, for example, historical perspective changes. All right. It is true that, of course, there were polities nominally controlling larger areas in a more direct central fashion than in the Middle Ages. A part of the illusion there is that the ancient world was actually poorer than the medieval one, and in a sense, peoples were a bit more limited in their reach. And we always have the sense that this is especially like put on the fore by documentaries about the Dark Ages and all this kind of BS, that basically the Middle Ages are the sort of tiny 100, 150 years at the very beginning of the Middle Ages, and the sheer traumatic magnitude of medieval civilization in political, military, and social power that in many cases also surpassed antiquity, depending on which terms, but mostly they were similar, as a matter of fact, because not too much had really changed. If you look at also technical means, is overshadowed, right? So ancient naval warfare actually witnessed, if you compare it especially to land battles, much fewer battles. This is really normal also in sort of other times and places in history. If you understand still today what a navy has to do, how you can't live on water, you can't build states on water, you can't conquer states through the control of the seas, but it's indirectly the case because at some point you have to go put on the land, owned land, not rather just some overall ground. So when you look at antiquity, you realize that there is actually really very few examples of sort of pretty clearly outlined level of naval warfare to be studied in a satisfactory documentary sense. There's a lot of archaeological evidence that naturally for antiquity has the lion's share, at least compared to, in relative terms, compared to what it is, for example, for the Middle Ages or from there on, where we have documentary evidence is basically for history proper, like by far the most important one, right? Archaeology is way overrated, also for a materialistic and deterministic bias. Unfortunately, lots of so-called conservatives, people interested in tradition, do not seem to understand this when they tell history. But really, and of course, archaeologically, we can understand better how a ship was literally built, and from that, we can understand more or less the performance and how or why this was designed. But it's always studying naval history that blows your mind to see how actually homogeneous, and if you think about it, relatively obvious in front, especially if you detach yourself from our modernistic abstractions, naval warfare really was. And however, in this sense, how it's also easy over this plateau, this relatively homogeneous, if not uniform plateau, to see sort of this epiphenomenal differences that tell us essentially what trend all this stuff was following. I should actually make a mini-series, because now I'm reasoning in specials more than else, that I should have done from quite a while, about the entirety of naval warfare, right? Really making, I don't know, maybe 2, maximum 3 episodes on literally naval warfare from its dawn to literally today, right? That would also cover, in fact, some aspect, because some of you have rightly pointed out that I haven't covered the, for example, the age of, say, look at the Napoleonic era, the golden age of the Royal Navy, etc. That's actually a very important time. And I did actually make some video back in the day about 18th century naval warfare, but indeed we haven't looked at that quite thoroughly in detail, right? So our series here about ships is a detailed technical study covering design, building techniques, the hundreds of or even thousands of rowers, as we will see better now, and marines needed aboard the largest ships. It's very interesting, for example, to observe the rather scarce, if not non-existent, difference, at least in an essential sense, between land forces and marines. We talk about the milites classiae that were, to an extent, but conceptually the same Roman legionaries on land. It's a bit like, I don't know, marines in the 18th century were fundamentally still sort of some troops that had a greater habituation to naval warfare, etc., but fundamentally fought also like land forces. Certain maneuvers like ramming required actually an incredible training from the side of the marines themselves, because on the deck they had really to move in a way that was conducive to the maximization of impact, like of probably the distribution of weight, of momentum in the most effective fashion for that breakthrough. There are also many misconceptions. Naturally, I remember certain debates on Facebook regarding people who said that nobody boarded before the Romans started using the corvus, which is a double nightmare of a statement, because from one side, of course, we know that boarding existed since the very dawn of naval warfare. And it's all well documented before the Romans, but also the corvus, as that we actually made. I made a video, not about the Roman ship, but let's say we talk about some encounters where the corvus was used, and we've seen that. I'm actually positive about its existence. Some scholars even arrived to deny it. I actually tend to trust by continental tradition a bit more sort of sources than primary sources than scholarship. But of course, it wasn't the game changer that we intend, but it tells us actually still something very important of how, for example, the Romans approached naval warfare compared to other peoples, and also how they wanted to represent themselves in later historiography. And surely there is something made up a bit in this exaggeration of the chronology, but it's something from later times that probably would have sort of sounded weird to the same Romans who won, maybe with the same corvus, but definitely ways that didn't really happen as later historiography, the one of just a couple of centuries later, would portray them. So the primary focus that we have in this series is on the warships of the Mediterranean region, for obvious reasons, not just the disproportionately more advanced civilization compared to the Atlantic, the Channel, the North Sea, and beyond, but because, of course, it's consequently the most overwhelmingly documented. Right, the Mediterranean had the best naval technology, also up to probably like the Renaissance, as a matter of fact. And even for most of the modern age, there wasn't this decisive edge of the later developments that we have documented. We talk about the thin and big fleet of the Venetians in the 17th century, when the Dutch and the English were also starting to sell their own oceanic ships to the Italians for their clashes against the Turks. And in this sense, it would be very important to realize that studying naval warfare is a bit, as I was saying before, an indicator for lots of other types of assessment, culturally wise and more. Right? We also made videos about Celtic, Germanic warships. We talked about the Needham ship. We talked about the Veneti. ship, the Batavian one. So there is actually a very interesting, in fact, Northern European naval warfare. One has to also contextualize a bit the scale in difference from the south, and or also how the Romans could, for example, take on the same Gallic ships in the ocean, right, on the Atlantic coast, and win at the same time. Because at the end of the day, it's not like there wasn't a big difference, but the biggest difference is relative to those times. So actually, ancient peoples were much more similar to one another than mostly, modern peoples are in terms of development. Even if it seems different to us, as if everything homogenized, but as a matter of fact, the divides today in world development are in absolute terms much bigger than at the time. When you look, I don't know, if you had seen a battle between the Romans and the Germans back in, I don't know, the 2nd century AD. Well, as a matter of fact, they would have looked overall pretty similar foes, right? Their hosts, their general tactics, the way they took on one another. And this is something that, in fact, relatively remains. And in every war, telling the truth, tends to create a syncresis, which is incredibly fascinating. We documented even up to our tragically bloody days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, and every people obviously has its own specificity, so that not just in the northern seas and the Baltic, etc. The way of fighting was different from region to region, but obviously also in the Mediterranean, as we just pointed out, given that civilization was more advanced, also gaps between different peoples were sort of more advanced and or pronounced. All right, there is all a wave of a series of waves of technological development. As you know, think about the Phoenicians, then the Greeks, then the Hellenistic period, and the Romans and the Carthaginians. So that some of these peoples are just, as we've seen here, the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, the Greeks, the Hellenistic era, they're just a continuation of one another to an extent, but adapting to a level of naval technology that, as we've seen in some videos, for example, the one about the early Italic naval participation, with a massive influence of the Etruscans that at some point pioneered naval warfare in the Mediterranean entire. Quite interesting. For that matter, always remember this homogeneity, because when we have looked at the Romans, as we were saying before, the myth that the Romans were simple landlubbers and they at some point started building ships out of the blue, does contain some truth, but it's not like they literally hadn't gone at sea ever. We've seen that there were some early treatises with Carthage where literally the Italics were demographically exploding, and their pirates were arriving up to North Africa, while the Carthaginians were more unitarily powerful as a naval force, but they couldn't afford to simply settle in Italy. And this is, again, for example, yet another very powerful indicator that puts sort of ethnic, moral dimensions far above any technical or even strategic, in fact, circumstance. But again, if you're interested, I can simply, in the top fixed comment down below, there is always the good list of related videos. Now, the Mediterranean powers that we cover here at large are we basically told them, the Hellenes, the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, the Hellenistic kingdoms, but above all Rome, because Rome at some point takes over the entire Mediterranean. It transforms it into a Roman lake, and as a consequence, it also dominates for most of the sort of the later phase of antiquity for centuries and centuries, and informs, but also the rest of it. In great part, it, as we just said, sort of develops in ways that had been pretty much obvious considering the development of those previous civilizations at sea. But let's remember again that there are some standards that are changing. Later antiquity, we said before, but that also remain. Right, the age of Gallae, for example, is something that really lasts up to pretty late in time, up to the 17th century, and with very well sort of precisely fitting characteristics that make it ideal for Mediterranean warfare. And not only because certain galleys were used also in the Baltic in the early 18th century, for example, were still somehow effective, we tend to think of modernity in two sclerotic ways. Those were times in which steel pikes were actually used, and before linear tactics themselves on land they fully developed, you really have to wait the 7 Years' War, which is actually in the second half of the 18th century. And so again, I made videos about this too, and remember that regardless of the didactic scanning of history and the art of war, for the sake of characterization, therefore making kids remember, actually, we say the expert knows that there is always a solid basis, a bulk of already pre-existing means that are fundamentally dominant and over which just a tiny bit is created. There isn't all of a sudden a radical explosion, revolution, all this kind of sensationalistically damaging terms that do not at all, in fact, describe with accuracy what was happening at the time. And then this Mediterranean peoples operated, as I said, the largest and most sophisticated fleets in antiquity, while the colder, stormier waters of northwest Europe produced very different Celtic, Germanic, and early Scandinavian, so to say, early Norse fighting ships that still receive attention. In our videos, I made some content of Viking ships. We also talk about the laydown, so how they were manned. That was mostly actually also for the case for land forces. So we will keep exploring these too. And at some point, I don't have that in range, but I do have enough material to really put together something on, I don't know, the Chinese, Japanese, Korean war fleets that I think is particularly important. So when we look at the Mediterranean shipbuilding tradition, we also realize the presence of the widest variety of warship designs, right? Featuring galleys that ranged from the very smallest craft to one extraordinary vessel exceeding 400 feet in length and carrying a crew of 7,000. All right. The incredible range ran from fast 20-oar scout boats to the colossal Tessaconteres built for Ptolemy IV of Egypt around 217 BC, which is very interesting because the Punic Wars were being fought exactly at this point, and Rome had actually already achieved essentially a relative dominance of the Mediterranean. And the latter, Tessaconteres were essentially ceremonial super galleys of some sort. Like there's also a bit perhaps an excess in defining what ceremonial really means, because also for weapons, this is just ceremonial. Why? Because it's, I don't know, very gilded, very expensive for whatever we're talking about. No, normally what does own the functional design and general characteristic, weight and so on of a normal weapon can be used by definition. Inkai will be used in combat because, by the way, we are in Hellenistic times. If you have an idea of what Hellenistic power is and where it stems from, Alexandrianly speaking, so what kind of metaphysical importance the military power has, so the manifestation technical talk, this was mostly also a bit of a Hellenic technologism behind it. This Hellenistic super weapons, such as, I don't know, the Scythian chariots, the huge catapults, all this stuff. The Hellenistic rulers in particular are a bit of a gigantistic bias. There is no doubt. And see where they ended, right? But it was really a matter of competition between these Hellenistic courts. So some people call the Tessaconteres a ceremonial super galleys longer than a modern destroyer, by the way, and requiring thousands of rowers simply to move, which kind of, in any case, makes sense considering the size and how the hell do you move. These were mostly just like enormous floating platforms that could essentially be not even necessarily unassailed, but they were so habitually accompanied with such a large amount of ships. If you could fill this one, it's because you had the largest fleet ever at the same time, so that they were functional to that broader strategic function as well. Naturally, the capacity to move even those fleets was at some point prohibitive. I mean, you wonder why, for example, Ptolemaic Egypt was so corruptedly bankrupt at some point they couldn't even afford a phalanx anymore by the time the Seleucids still used it, because if you don't have a functional state, you can't even be that big and controlling the straits between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. But it's not really going to work in the field. So again, I made some videos about Ptolemaic Egypt, very interesting chapter, so to say. But in general, right, we can be concrete about this all. The Macedons also had something pretty interesting around. Basically, all the major Hellenistic powers of the world, basically all maritime to an extent, they had at least a maritime power, except you're talking about Bactria, but we're there, right? In contrast, the ships of the northern regions that we listed before followed an independent evolutionary path, which is kind of obvious and tells you how much the seas influenced warship building. Certain vessels built in northern waters proved allegedly superior to their Mediterranean equivalents in this era, at least not in a way that Mediterraneans couldn't take them over. I mean, the example of pretty big ships that had this advantage mostly in the height. It's also the height of the sides, etc. They were difficult to board, right? Caesar had some luck. Always the famous Fortuna Caesar is probably metaphysical concept of Caesar's own religion that brought wind to seas to have the galleys have it easier to the galleys that the Romans had built from the same goal on the Atlantic, and cutting the riggings of these ships, etc., immobilizing them, brought essentially to their takeover. So in that sense, there isn't such a thing like an absolute weapon, an absolute ship, or whatever. It's mostly just like the power you can display and whether you're going to win or not. And so in that case, actually, it turned out that the Roman Liburni were, and I also made a video about the Liburni, were, this is, as you know, is a pretty generic term telling the truth, were actually superior to their fleet, were superior. At large, as we just prefigured, northern shipwrights developed high-ended, sail-oriented, shallow draft longships that could outperform at least low freeboard Mediterranean oared galleys in rough seas and were far better suited to the violent weather of the North Atlantic and Baltic. Even though the Baltic not only is a closed sea, but it has specific certain coastlines and the Swedish part in particular that favors actually galley use. And we'll see better in some other video. And so there is a bit too much of a, especially when you get to the Viking era. They have the idea that the Vikings were great. The Norse in general, aside from their Viking activity, were also great explorers, great seafarers. They had definitely a very advanced and novel technology that allowed them to do what they were more involved with, to say the least. But what appears to be obvious in general is that even in terms of cultural representation, admittedly, ships do not draw this enormous attention. I think they are some of the most beautiful, in that sense, concrete indicator of what these peoples did, to show also a bit comparatively what others did at the same time. And yet, in a cultural sense, we are, at least maybe not strictly not in the naval aspect, but say in general, told so much about the Vikings, but we seem to forget the constant continuity in galley warfare superiority throughout also the High Middle Ages in Mediterranean. And so there are major powers eventually will also develop the strongest fleets of the Middle Ages that in that sense are not really as presented, because how many shows have you seen on, I don't know, Genoa, right, or even Venice? But for some reason, again, we don't fully picture that. So actually looking at galley warfare is, we should make it more for later times as well, but at least the medieval ones, the later medieval ones. There are a few, can't say few publications, because if you actually look around, you find stuff. But again, in strictly disclosure terms, in pop history, in, or I don't know, war game series stuff, there isn't really much around. It's if this part of medieval naval warfare is actually disproportionately more advanced. We're completely severed from the historical cultural horizons. This didn't really exist. So, of all these ships, we provide on the channel this detailed descriptions, hopefully enough, especially of the various types, right, and comparing them. A number of general observations, however, as we've also made videos about this, apply a bit to all ancient vessels, in that we essentially derive also from the ones discussed on the channel itself. So that you see, for example, I'm making this video right now, but after many ship types discussed, but also we all made something more generic before doing that. So it's important to inform like the general and the detailed, because otherwise you can't really orient yourself to see properly the depth, the perspective, the dimension of this all. Now, before passing also to other type of ships, for example, I never made a video about triremes or quinqueremes. We talked about the Liburnia. We talked about the northern Drakkar style craft. We have here to explain somehow the several fundamental construction and operational principles of these ships. I made one video, for example, I already talked about the general performance of ancient medieval warships. All right. We already pointed out how these principles are essentially valid for nearly every ship discussed, including, again, between Northern and Southern Europe. That doesn't really matter. They all function more or less along the same concept. Also, naval tactics, by the way, are, first of all, as a specialist in land tactics of the same era, I must say that they're, of course, very different types of engagement, but let's say in outline, not just these naval battles are pretty similar to land battles in deployment, in broader line principle, and so on. But in this sense, they are equally homogeneous between one another. There isn't this enormous mobility or game of maneuvers and sort of complicated, especially at the individual ships, how to say, consumption. There is a pretty sort of locked fighting. It mostly also gets down to boarding, because that's the way how you object, either through ramming or boarding at the same time, because sometimes ramming allowed you to, it was very risky. You could remain stuck in the enemy ship that was sinking, but to an extent it allowed for a while also some interest. You literally enter in another ship, you could from the deck pour your marines on the enemy ones. But for the rest, it was this ship lines interlocked, and at some point one section started collapsing with a domino effect that is really resemblant of, again, land battles. Now, excavated remains of ancient ships reveal that, almost without exception, both northern and Mediterranean craft were constructed back to front, compared with modern practice. Today, a ship is begun by laying the keel, erecting the ribs upward from it, and then fastening the hull, planking to those ribs. Modern shipbuilding is skeleton first. The strong keel and heavy framing come first, then the skin is attached. All right, this is the concept. Every ancient wreck discovered so far proves the exact reverse was the universal ancient method. An ancient shipbuilder, however, began with the outer shell. An ancient shipbuilder began with the outer shell. He assembled the hull planking first, joining plank to plank with extremely precise mortise-and-tenon joints that were tightly fitted by skilled carpenters. Only after this monocoque shell was complete were internal frames inserted to reinforce and stiffen the structure. This gives you also a dimension of how important the hull really was. as a basis. And as a result, by the way, these internal frames could be also considerably lighter than the robust ribbing found in modern ships. Equally, the hull was that more robust, and this had a lot to do probably with the warship usage that was made of them. Thousands of wooden tenons were driven into matching mortises and often locked with tree nails or copper nails, creating a rigid, self-supporting hull before any internal supports were added, exactly like the stress skin fuselage of an aircraft, right? So later inserted ribs could be light and widely spaced. In the Mediterranean, carvel construction was standard. The hull planks were laid edge to edge, producing a smooth outer surface. This flush carvel, so to say, planking gave the fastest, cleanest water flow for rowing speed as well. It was the overwhelming Mediterranean preference for warships. All right. This also shows you how important, let's say, the speed technically was. This wasn't much. Of course, the faster the ship, the less maneuverable it becomes, and this is actually an indicator of the, in fact, more collective nature of this naval warfare. How tactics were involving larger arrays that had to maximize a frontal clash. Right, when you start having smaller ships, as we said before, for example, late antiquity, or you see also like mostly the barbarian used, you realize that just like skirmishers, like guerrilla, they could withstand less impact as a whole by the mass of the enemy on a more advanced fleet. And they tended to focus on maneuvering, but mostly also for eluding maneuvers, rather than properly taking on through agility or speed, like those are the bigger elements. We've seen, I don't know, also in some videos about the Scots, the Giles, etc., how, for example, the Roman fleets of Britain were able to chase these Celts and also part of the Germanic fellow pirates up to Iceland. All right, Constantius Chlorus wanted to see the mythic Thule and the Hyperborean Sea, as a matter of fact, and there we'll talk more about him in that regard. But that particular say vibe was the same one you see in open field. There is the stereotype of the barbarian, by the way, that was not finding in clothes for maid. This is absolutely false, right? As we said before, if you look at the Celtic hosts, Germanic hosts, they're actually pretty well orderly. They're the same nomads, also in their actually weaker overall capacity compared to sanitaries. They all have a very specific, ordered and disciplined art of war and so on. But it's obvious that sort of in general, even just in political terms, say when you think about Rome fighting, you think about the legions, you think about also the auxiliaries revolving around them, and in this sense, some kind of lighter warfare from the side of the less cohesively solid polities of, say, Central Europe, whatever. So, again, they really all look very similar. They fight all pretty much in the same way. This could be said at sea as well, but when you look at how these ships were built, in general, aside from the modern paradigm, you realize that the Mediterraneans tended to smash a lot. And in this sense, also ships were bigger. Right? They tended towards greater development in a structural sense to begin with, especially in the heyday of classical antiquity, for different reasons. The Greeks, everything sort of started, also reflected their political instance. If you look at the early Greeks, they're all, again, different polis. Yes, there are many leagues, but they put together quite considerable fleets. But in general, like Hellenistic times, Roman times, the Carthaginians, these are all much more power concentrated, in fact, polities, and they put together much larger ships, fleets, and ships, as we've seen before also with Ptolemy IV, except, as we're saying, not necessarily before, but in other videos, and this is true also for land forces, we know much more, say, about classical Hellenic naval warfare, thanks to Thucydides, thanks to all the history, most of the Peloponnesian War, but also of of other ones. Why? Because socially speaking, the people who wrote at the time were very much into the thing. They were politicians, as soldiers, and so on. So they saw the whole thing. Then, in say Macedonian times, nobody writes really anymore. There are just courtiers in the monarchic centers, and the average peasantairos at on land would not write you, would not leave you what, I don't know, Xenophon would write up to literally the last century. And so we know actually much less about the Macedonian phalanx than we know about the Atlantic Obliqua, even though the former is more recent than the latter. Equally for Rome, right? We don't have this enormous amount of information about the Romans were in it for Polybius, for example, up to a certain point, up to the 2nd century BC. Then the Romans in the 1st century BC start consistently writing more on their own, and they tell us also, in fact, stories in slightly, probably different narrative work. So imagine at sea, as we said before, not being there so many naval battles, how sort of few we know in general about how this combat, probably the information that we can gather, at times relatively to the same ships, because we don't even have this enormous amount of finds, not just maritime marine archaeology is way more expensive than land one already is, but in general, like even though surely vessels are plenty of like at the bottom of the sea, of what remains of them if they preserve themselves for different reasons, but we also, like, these ships were like today, these means were decommissioned, were dismantled, were lost, were destroyed, and in a sense we will hardly ever know how the aforementioned mega ship of Ptolemy the Fourth really looked like. All right, we have some think about Caligula's ships that's in a lake. It's a completely different story. It was truly a floating court, floating palace, but we're talking here something much more, in fact, militarily, much more military and expendable to begin with for that role. So few northern vessels also adopted carvel building, quite possibly under Roman influence, by the way, because this was overarchingly dominant also in the northern world. Yet the typical northern method remained clinker construction, in which notorious, like this is again very popularized by Viking history, each plank slightly overlapped the one below it. Clinker or lapstrake building with its overlapping planks forming a series of strengthening steps produced tougher, more flexible hulls that absorb wave impact far better in heavy northern seas. Right, and only a minority of northern ships switched to the smoother Roman-style carvel method after contact with the empire, and for reasons that naturally also had to do with the type of employment that these ships normally had. I mean, if again because all this also, everything was basically coastal navigation at this point, not entirely, and in fact it's arguable that in fact northern seas were more often crossed for reasons that were in this sense very operational or strategic, but let's say mostly tied to the individual sort of objective of a given war band in this amphibious circumstance, right? Everything was more maneuverable, smaller, and so you could reach sort of more different directions. If you're, however, in literally a backwater of the continent, so if you have to face, say, the Romans that control the southern shores of the North Sea, well, those guys over there can't put together a much bigger crashing naval force that at some point no power in antiquity in the northern world could even thought to assemble. So that's the dominance, that's the influence, and of course there were some ships that we know also, by the way, during Civilis revolt, that there were some Roman ships were probably taken by the Germans and operated in those areas that, as we've seen, were also Romanized, and there were auxiliaries rebelling and so on. So we're talking sort of pretty obvious vastly greater proximity to that Roman type of warfare. Nevertheless, we're also looking at a type of combat that, strategically speaking, could form just in specific circumstances, right? We probably, again, don't see how much warfare was going on, especially the smaller parties for patrolling the seas, etc. So the clinker building may have, well, I mean, we're sure about it, was used by the Romans as well, but just as they were adapting to that kind of northern theater, there were other influences. I don't know, if you look at the Romans, were pretty active in the Red Sea. Surely there were some aspects about the ships they used there that, although pretty similar to the ones that could be there, like, were relatively adaptable and or adapted in that for that context. Now, in Mediterranean merchant ships, I made a couple of videos about both the Hellenic and the Roman ones, as a matter of fact, were safeguarded against terror of worm and other marine borers by seating the underwater portion of the hull with thin lead sheets. In the war Mediterranean, shipworm could reduce an unprotected hull to lacework in months. Right, so trading vessels were routinely covered below the waterline with hammered lead sheets nailed over tarred cloth and expensive but effective ancient anti-fouling systems. Warships, by contrast, probably at least lacked this protection. They were routinely pulled ashore and beached when not in use. So we actually think that things were pretty similar. There were some fleets that had to be at sea for 4 months, as a matter of fact. So in some way they would have done it. But in any case, most of the times the ships were so precious and much more sturdily built, more complex built, more expensive. They spent the winter months hauled out of the water and housed under cover. So the danger from borers was there still, but it was far less pressing, right? This aspect also underscores the actually enormous costs of fleets, right? There is all an economy. I made one of my earliest videos on ancient naval warfare in particular was measuring the proportion of expenses between the Athenian fleet at the peak of the Parthenope's city's thalassocracy and today's, I think it was a video from 2020, 2021, the US Navy today. And with a bit of approximation, we came to the conclusion, this is sort of random in a way, but that, at least by scale, the costs of the Athenian Navy are strikingly similar. But even not just by scale, to the, in relative terms, naturally, to the ones of the U.S. Navy in sheer financial terms, but for the relative politics. So I find it very interesting, and we observed there also how simply costly a ship really was. Right, today we're not really just talking about that. It's actually an interesting video topic we could explore at some point. But land forces were much more economical, and we all know how crushing the costs were. In order to have a robust fleet, you really had to be a pretty solid power, and that's why, as I was saying before, there was actually a greater divide between naval warfare and fleets across cultures at the time than there was in terrestrial forces. Right, it's one of those things that you have properly to reach a level of development in order to have even properly the advantage of using a fleet in a functional remunerative way. Otherwise, in fact, the cost-benefit ratio is prohibitive and crushing. Right, this is very interesting. There are similar instances, as we said before. For example, if you look at the Hellenistic powers, not all Hellenistic powers used the Macedonian phalanx. If you're talking about the diadochoi, because Hellenistic can be a wider thing, but let's say Pergamon, Western Anatolia, full wake of Alexander's conquest and successor states, could not afford a phalanx. It's never witnessed. Of course, they would have had other phalanxes like hoplitic ones and so on, but in order to field the phalanx, you must it's something dreadfully expensive. Just building the pikes, you would be surprised by what kind of work went behind the pikes. They had to be long enough, but also to be made in ways that would be resistant, elastic enough. But especially you must have a very big amount of phalanges in order to have an effective phalanx line. You must also invest an enormous amount in terms of maintaining these guys in military colonies, having a routine exercises to maintain the collective training of phalanx. It's a sheer amount. It's such an enormous cost that at some point, first of all, the other colony could never states at least could never field one, and at some point some that did, like before we mentioned Egypt, like at some point they stopped because not just they went bankrupt, but in that sense they could simply not afford. They could afford other forces, but they could not afford that type of phalanx. Imagine fleets being something of that kind. Imagine being crashingly expensive and therefore being useless unless you have just an enormous amount of sea to control, just like, I don't know, the Romans had, for example, the Carthaginians. And therefore, it's very interesting that the greatest developments in this sense would actually be accomplished later from the Western Mediterranean, all right? Especially Rome, that was, as we've seen, relatively not foreign to naval experience, but to at least that type of that scale, like of naval warfare, that we'll actually achieve later, right? So this is incredibly interesting. Never underestimate the cargoes ships, the merchant ships, because these were the ones who, just like the settler training armies, made the entire fleets move at large, could supply just also land armies, but it required an escort. If, say, I don't know, we've seen even the supply cargo from the Danubian fleet of Rome during the Dacian Wars, right? There weren't many threats, so it was purely a logistical vessel. But say if you have to keep like all the grain, you have to feed again those hundreds of rowers and of marines per ship and so on. You need that kind of support. You need this enormous amount of material. And you can easily calculate that, because if you look at human labor and how much you need to work every day and so on, to fighting, rowing, etc., like, you know how much was necessarily needed. And so that can't be improvised. You really need all that stuff. And that's why I also made videos on that. Now, light, narrow war galleys could be run up onto any beach every night and were stored under sheds or simple roofs all winter, keeping them dry for half the year, more making heavy lead sitting unnecessary. But there were also cataphract ships, for example. So again, we can't enter now in the details of that because it's very complicated. And it should be pointed out, by the way, that we are aware of these ships mostly through the aforementioned documentary information rather than any archaeological find. There is an enormous debate. Part of the reason why I started this series is that there is an incredibly interesting methodological work behind this that makes us naturally all possible sources available regarding these almost ghost or fantasy or maybe fictional or legendary would be better ships that we know the name of. They are described to us to some extent, but that we can't figure out how they were properly built. And there is an enormous debate on how this could actually be. I mean, even in the video about the origin of early artillery, that is also a very technical thing. I discovered that there is a not necessarily huge historiography about this, but let's say an enormous level of speculative theories regarding how specific pieces of artillery, other military technology more, this is true also in a more civilian context, if you can so say, could actually be like. Because maybe, I don't know, we have a Byzantine miniature from a lost original classical text or some illustration. We have all the huge question marks regarding how this stuff was practically built. No, I think the most interesting aspect of this is that in a sense, they didn't care so much about describing this technology. Even the Greeks, that as we explained, were a bit more technologically fixated, and especially in Hellenistic times, sort of exasperated certain achievements, surely built something of that kind. I'm personally always sort of tendentially positive whenever a source tells us that something was there, and if it is within the realm of the plausible, why not? Right, considering even just by scale the costs again of other that were normally entailed by warfare, by naval warfare, and so on. Like things do make sense that this technology could exist, but they didn't care so much, after all, to describe to us what they were. In fact, it's not even technologism as we understand it in a modernistic sense from the Greek side. It's mostly this ideal, really, that the Greeks had, that if you follow just some specific, almost geometric path in a metaphysical sense, you could achieve an unprecedented level of power. It wasn't much about the activation of a spiritual dimension, but sort of nailing the right proportions, right? This old had, it's like an old, as we've seen also in the video about the Dorian migration, a theological principle and so on. But say the more advanced and secular Greeks, to an extent, sort of isolated, especially after they were conquered by the Romans, within their own self-created universe of perfection, right? It's very Byzantine also in hindsight. They still, even though caring so much about this theory, they care more about the theory than the practice, so that even when they actually built something, they didn't even care too much to explain how it was actually built. They didn't care that much. They do. It's completely normal also for the sources of the era not to really tell us all their secrets and how all this stuff worked in practice. It's just far from the actual interests of these populations. They mostly wanted to tell you that they had created this, but they didn't care so much in terms of strict, like, now I'll make you a list of how to build one on your own. It was also assumed, of course, at the time that you would know how to build one at some point. In this Hellenistic and Roman era, at some point, as you know, there were famous statements like, I don't know, we topped the possible technology of the world. There is not improvement that we can. In their way, they were actually right, because they had saturated a bit what mostly technology will remain for pretty long time, another good millennium, basically. And there wasn't much that could appear on the horizon that would give any extra sort of edge, right? So that at that point, it was also not much of a big news that you could build, I don't know, monster ships. Somebody had done it in the past. It had been done. It was feasible. That was the important thing to get from all of this. It wasn't much telling you how they mechanically built a ship. We are the ones obsessed today by, we want to know how the size, how big, we must reconstruct this. I personally never really found any of this stuff interesting, mostly because my sort of background seems to be way more Western, also in ancient terms regarding properly the approach to warfare, the moral dimension, sort of not just in fact the Clausewitzian way to that, but still. Now, other things we could discuss. The usual service of a life of a warship was roughly the one of a generation, 20-25 years, right? Although the longevity record belongs to a famous 16, the flagship of the Macedonian Navy was enormous, with 16 benches of oars from both sides, by the way, which remained. This was the flagship of the Macedonian Navy, so it was enormous. The monster ones we said before, and which remained seaworthy enough for the Romans to sail it in triumph up the Tiber more than a century after its original launch, which is also a great record, even for, as we've seen, the problems of the perishment as well. One of the reasons why naval warfare was so expensive was not just maintaining the crew and everything, but this was this constant upkeeping of the warship. In fact, that's also a topic that we mostly encounter in medieval warfare, but let's say also in ancient times, not like there were some permanent navies on normally, right? For empires that controlled everything, kind of like with Rome, Carthage mostly had such an involved aristocracy that they built ships just on their own. So they had some more concentrated level, but in a sense, that was because they went in parallel with an establishment that was heavily involved at sea. But the other powers required more ad hoc fleet building and also maintaining a fleet. If you were not really using it, it was a bit too much. Like there is a bit of this kind of thinking during the Peloponnesian War in political terms, like how or when do we increase our number of galleys to take on the enemy or whatever. This was very much still ad hoc meant. And so even though there are actual powers in ancient as in medieval history that had virtually a permanent fleet, in a sense, it was so not much because it was necessarily understood as a unitarily, more often than not that this did not exist either, a necessarily permanent naval force was always there, parked, wait to be unleashed. But in fact, when you look at the exception confirming the rule, which is Rome, indeed, Rome for centuries practically controlled the entire Mediterranean. There was no piracy, which was incredible historically, because nobody had really ever achieved that before. Now, most warships became leaky or structurally weak after 2 or 3 decades of constant beaching and battle damage, right? The gigantic Macedonian 16 that we've seen before was a polyreme with multiple men per oar built around 300 BC. And it was still impressive enough in 167 BC for the victorious Romans to parade it, as we've seen, up the Tiber as a trophy. Well over 130 years old, at least in estimate, and still afloat. Imagine the prestige, like the fact that the Antigonians had definitely, this is after Pydna, so the fact of the final destruction of Macedon. And so this is definitive. It's like taking over Alexander's country and looking at this. It does not live in Macedon was particularly projected towards naval ventures. Like in general, also Hellenistic kingdoms at large were more continental powers than they weren't particularly enterprising at sea. They had pretty big ships, but in fact their employment was also somehow ad hoc. We will talk more about Hellenistic, and we have to talk about a bit more about the Diadochi in general, telling the truth. But in this sense, it is worth noticing that there is plenty of good information, so to say, on the type of, at least on the moral value that such a ship, eventually as a worthy trophy for the Roman conquerors, really represented. And we don't know what happened to this ship, by the way. Now, even though the joinery demanded great precision, as we've seen, ancient shipyards could sometimes achieve astonishing speed as well. Wall fleets were completed and ready for service only months after the order to begin building had been issued, a feat especially associated with Roman naval organization during, namely, the First Punic War. We've partially seen this, and there is all a naval history, again, of the Punic Wars that is fortunately detailed by just mostly like in fact the sources that thankfully describe for us this clash, mostly from the Greek background. I made a video about the Battle of Cape Economus in 256 BC during the First Punic War. It was an enormous clash, and it illustrates, I would say, pretty well what this whole clash was sort of really about. And so I'm really glad in general to see this. I'm thinking with AI now, I could even make animations of battles in general, both at sea and land, to see how properly the movement, how it worked, right? It would be schematically very easy. Let's say if you make photo after photo, picture after picture, like everything sort of going to look like an animation after all. As far as properly the military logic you have to understand of these battles. The fastest documented case of shipbuilding, as we were saying before, took just a month and a half from the moment instructions were given to start cutting timber until the ships were finished. Despite the thousands of mortise and tenon joints requiring expert craftsmanship, Rome in particular could mobilize huge workforces in pre-stock timber. During emergencies, most famously the First Punic War, they built, rigged, and launched entire battle fleets in a matter of months, with the recorded record being a complete fleet readied from forestries to floating warships in only 45 days. This is literally an industrial times performance that remains breathtaking even by modern standards, and that in fact we have no clue how they actually achieved. I mean, today we can do it with our own means, building ships. With our own means to build the ships, obviously. But how they did it with their own means, we have no clue whatsoever. I mean, we have a bit an idea also how Rome, I don't know, the famous bridge on the Rhine, like, these feats of military history that remained, especially from the Roman military engineering, and probably unmatched. And we realized that they could do this. Like, it's within the realm of feasible. Again, it's not propaganda, right? They knew how to do this because the stakes, the psychological effect of what the Germans saw, for example, what the Romans were building, the bridge over the Rhine, it's something that was entirely was worth the expedition, itself. Everything was on the edge in many ways. Now, the reason why Rome developed her own military engineering superiority that was unmatched in ancient times, in particular for this large-scale type of accomplishment, that was also one of quality, not cheap stuff, because they literally took over the Carthaginians at sea, and without having ever mobilized such a huge fleet against what were at that time the best mariners in the Western Mediterranean, or against any other for that matter. Was due to, in fact, political issue, social issue. The Romano-Italic Confederacy. You could mobilize this enormously populated peninsula that was also very rich, and so it had, just as we've seen, this explosion. It was swelling, like in terms of sheer explosion to take over the world. And the Carthaginians didn't have something like that. They didn't have an interland. Even the Libo-Phoenicians were something completely different. They lived in a very different way from the Carthaginians. The Romans and the Italics managed to put together evenly because the Italian coastlines were provided, as we explained in those videos about the early Italic naval activity since the Sea People's invasions, to which these early Italics participated, by the way, and not just usually like what you say, the Etruscans, the Sicilians, the Sardinians. We're talking probably the Italic, the Apenninic peoples, the fact being that Rome, even though it's not that they exaggerated the accomplishment, the Romans did not do that. For all those people who think, it's Roman propaganda, what the Romans actually did was, if anything, the opposite. They were essentially representing themselves as more primitive than they were back then, because they wanted to show how simply better in line of principle they were compared to the Greeks, for example, and how they could even improve on their own on these technologies that they had largely gotten from that part of the world. Again, we've seen this well in the video about early artillery, how they were able to... The first people to use early artillery were, according to you, the Romans, with Hellenic technicians, obviously, but in clashing in central Italy, basically, against some coastal towns, and in that sense being the first one to really deploy. I mean, even though they wouldn't, as we've seen also recently in our video about the Roman conquest of Spain, get large amounts of torsion catapults in particular until the conquest of Cartagena, Nova Carthago in Spain. Even though already from the First Punic War, taking over the Magna Graecia, the Siceliotes, the Italiotes, they had absorbed much of that polyurcetic capacity. But on a small scale, they hadn't really needed it over properly by the Hellenistic scale. That was enormous. So admittedly, also the Romans didn't need it at that point. But this also just for saying how actually accessible this military technology really was, and how many political, even before strategic reasons, would bring the Romans to simply step up at some point saying, okay, well, let's show the world that we can obviously get all this stuff, right? They were showing that they were sort of landlubbers In part also, if anything, there's something about Roman propaganda regarding having represented the italics before Roman conquest a bit more primitives. This is actually the Greeks built on from previous times, but and also for different cultural reasons. But the early italics, as we've seen, already had like their own ships, their own naval activities for quite a while. So it's not strange that by the time of the First Punic War, when Rome has already conquered basically all of Italy from the 80s, the 70s, they could basically at that point make leverage materially, not just in terms of manpower, if anything, labor force mostly in this case, to create this enormous amount of ships that could take on the Carthaginians, successfully taking on the Carthaginians, and at sea, like winning. Not quite just for that the victory was political before, and the Punics sacked basically in that war in a paralyzingly political sense. And so when you look at the overall picture, you realize that there is an enormous, at some point, conflation in our mentality of what this faction had in their roster as opposed to this other one, but you don't realize that special military technology was not irrelevant, but essentially subordinated to practically any other military aspect. And it wasn't the most important thing per se. Even just, for example, siege artillery. So on these ships, as you know, mounted pretty large stone throwers and all this stuff. Those were also an Hellenistic thing, mostly. It was pioneered, as we've seen first. We mentioned being used by the Romans because we're talking that because there were other types of artillery, but the torsion catapults, we're talking stuff pioneered in Syracuse, right? It was the stronger of the Greeks. Then Macedon comes around and takes over everything, and you have Alexander literally creating the Isthmus of Tyre, still exists as such because it was an island before him. So this enormous feats of military engineering. You have the Demetrius Poliorcetes that takes the name, in fact, after this. Actually, a very unfortunate military career, regardless of this enormous military technological accomplishments. So you understand how actually varied this really is, and how when we look at history in general, we are essentially, it's if you read history through this lens that I'm offering a little bit, you can immediately understand how chronically and terminally technologistic and modernistic and secularistic we are. Because to us, it's all primarily about technology, is what they knew, where was it written, how do you know, like all these kind of things, and missing the entire picture that is actually much better documented and indirectly telling you more about that military technology than trying to find the number of the thing. So honestly, part of the reason I make this series is also to show that, to show how technical differences so important in military technology is enormously important, but at large, right, they are just means to an end. They are particularly tied to an entire vision, sort of the of politics, of military, of intervention, of action, of moral forces invested in. It's not really much about the technology per se, as you see in every war. So actually, I was seeing here, we have a relatively nourished naval warfare playlist that I'm honestly very proud of. I think not many people watch it, but as I was saying at the beginning, if you consider the importance of naval warfare and how sort of variegated and from how much you can actually squeeze out of that, and considering how most people don't really actually care about it, making these videos is important. I see we don't even have that few views. Like, we get a pretty consistent amount of views on this because likely nobody really talks about it. And that's a problem overall, and we tend maybe to minimize it. But you do need naval warfare. It's just like those topics that you would say, but what do you actually do with this? And then you make the video and you discover that it's probably one of the best things you can do because you need it as a complement, just like with military technology. It's not like it's irrelevant. When you do it, you understand how useful it is, but then you also realize how it's part of the bigger picture. It wouldn't make sense just to talk only about this when you also have, in fact, the whole and broader picture. So you see, for example, this was a cycle slash lottery extracted topic, but it was worth making it. This is the kind of the boring videos that I say, oh my God, we always want to watch. But in a sense, right, these are much better than others that we regularly do. They are more like storytelling. They always have a level of criticism. I mean, Schwerpunkt remains always of the same mold. We just improve qualitatively speaking. But let's say there are different paces, and the art of war has mostly to do with understanding these shades, right? You have to primarily be able to understand them politically, morally, historically, culturally, but also through the technicalities of warfare and beyond. So I think it is really interesting, and it is really important to discuss the whole thing, because without this, the whole picture is missed, right? I don't know what's the next topic. I think actually I prepared, it's the Byzantine drama. That many of you will say, wow, Byzantine drama. Yeah, I prepared this last week, and unfortunately there aren't so many pictures of it, but the information is actually pretty solid, and I'm really looking forward to make that episode, because you see, it intersects so much. It's Byzantine history, it's naval warfare, it's military technology, it's a unit type. It's really something that projects you into that world, and we have all this stuff forever coming, and hopefully, in fact, adding something more concrete, more consistent, more important. And we really have to do a lot, right? There is, at this point in the channel's history, really, there is such a vivacity, such a relevance in everything we're doing here that it can't be forgotten. It can't be simply taken for granted as such. So I personally really care about this, and I also care in general about how we're faring as a channel, because we're heading towards 30,000. So I ask you really to promote all this in like this topic, for example. It will not get sucked in by the algorithmic whirlwind, but surely, right? It's a unique video. It has its dignity, and in fact, quite a robust one. And it's important to. This is my policy at this point. It's a bit like a composite bow. You have to add sort of the two elements, the flexible, the more courageous one, because otherwise you can't get really the spring for the channel as well. And now it's mostly because I realized through years of the lottery slash cycle that there were some videos that were so important for the channel and that also got so many views. That is not the most important criterion, but still, like it's relevant. That I had totally no idea of, that made me understand so much about the rest, and that in practice, like, wouldn't be fundamentally so relevant. Wouldn't it's really something you need to talk about on the channel, because it informs all the rest, right? And then at some point we'll exhaust other branches of the cycle. As you know, we're starting actually with a very beautiful video, the series about contemporary history, not warfare just, but history as well. Actually, there's going to be specials about this because of sort of broader reasons, but again, that's how you intersperse both. You don't see all the work behind this. I can assure you, it does take a toll. There is, you even imagine what do we talk about, and not because I wonder what to, but I wonder in this sense, given the enormity of content that we have to cover, which to pick if I have to choose. That the lottery slash cycle was so important for years because it allowed us to just to entrust ourselves to it, say, okay, whichever topic we're going to cover it, right? Today, it is slightly different. It is slightly more about the policy, how this thing is crafted, and how we can deal with this, in fact, in a more coherent way. So it's, again, really important, and we will see it better if anything, in another moment. I see here, again, we made also a relatively long video because it wasn't chit chat. I think framing the topic per se is really important. It is, and I really want to make that series about naval warfare. Really have to talk about it more frequently. Can't be just every once in a while. It really must be something. We can't. Too bad we can't make only one video a day. At least that's exactly the the time that I can dedicate to it. And yeah, I mean that's how YouTube is. Unfortunately, with AI slop and everything, you realize that there are bigger channels making easily more videos and having, in this sense, much more of a sort of grip on the audience that are and what can you do about it? It's mostly they focus, again, it's the 20 minutes long video with shiny pictures, with, in this sense, especially now with AI graphic aspects, etc. But especially when you look at, for example, these channels now are uploading 2 hours long videos. It's just the sum of their own single videos. They're so lame because they have the introduction and they don't even cut the part in which to say, today we see this, and today it's every video. It's so sloppy, it's so lazy. Like, just cut everything in a coherent narrative so that the video flows more smoothly, right? And no, and unfortunately so, because you always have to, unfortunately, consider these issues. But that's also YouTube, and YouTube is weird. I don't know how it's changing, but it seems to me that, at least I'm glad that to have your support, to have had so many sort of opportunities to look better at the broader picture. Thanks also to this video, so to receive the support that I've received. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.